Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à la session en temps opportune de ce soir. Let me set the outset that although tonight's talk is Brexit related, if you're an environmental protester worried about climate change, you're at the wrong meeting. At tonight's session, the naked truth about the French Jews in London will be revealed. When the Brexit vote took place on the 23rd of June 2016, the Leave campaign polled 51.9% to the Remain 48.1%. Very broadly, the Remain campaign focused on economic issues, whereas the Leave campaign concentrated on migration and sovereignty. The debate continues unabated, though the focus and the issues have changed somewhat. Many years ago, it was reported that Harold Macmillan, in response to a journalist when asked what is most likely to blow governments off course, said, "Events, my dear boy, events." Recently, the Archbishop of Canterbury urged the public to pray for MPs to come to a decision that has widespread support and for a process that brings national agreement, and his prayers may have been answered since tonight the Prime Minister said she is offering to meet the leader of the opposition to achieve a consensus. In this vein, it has even been suggested that to settle Brexit, Roy Hodgson, the ex-England football manager, should be made Prime Minister, since he has a fantastic record of leaving Europe swiftly. We hear very little now about Turkey joining the EU, and much more about the Irish backstop, chlorinated chickens, and just-in-time supply chains, which hardly figured in the original discussion. But to tonight's topic. There was indeed discussion about the right to permanent residence under EU law and whether it would survive Brexit, but it was clear that it would depend on the arrangements the EU and the UK would settle on upon departure. As far as I'm aware, there was far more discussion about EU nationals from Poland, the Republic of Ireland and Romania than any of the other countries. There was little discussion about French nationals, and certainly no public discussion about the problems that French Jews in the UK would face. Even if there had been, with all the major issues being discussed, this would have attracted little attention, and people would have said quel dommage and passed on swiftly to other things. But the issue of French Jews in London is of particular importance because of the current situation in France. This week's Jewish Chronicle, which carried a news feature, "There is no future for Jews in France," gives a greater sense of immediacy and urgency to the issue of what French Jews in London should do post-Brexit. Who better to deal with this topic than Michel Huberman, the creative director of Harif, who lived in Paris during the 1980s running a fashion business in the Sentier amongst the French Jews and continues to have a pied-à-terre in the community. She is the CEO of a fashion international manufacturing organisation and was, I believe, the inventor of holes in denim jeans.
Oh, where did you find all of this information?
She is the author of the successful Fashion Magic, Fun Ways to Decorate Your Clothes, and pioneered in-store demonstrations at John Lewis. She has appeared on the TV programme The Clothes Show and was at the first NEC Consumer Show. She has successfully designed and launched new products and demonstrated at over 500 exhibitions in the UK, USA, France and Norway. In 2000, she was a major award winner of the Female Inventor of the Year Awards for the foiling wand and has a permanent demonstration space in Hamleys Toy Store in London for one of her best inventions, the Write and Rub foiling pen. Please welcome Michel Huberman.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me tonight, and thank you for doing all of that research. I'm not sure what websites you found this on, but that's good to know that all of that information is out there. Well, I'm the creative director of Harif, which is an association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I've left these around for everybody. So we've got a poster over here, which just has got a few figures, but I know a lot of people focus on that when I'm talking, but you can just take one of these, there's some at the back, and you've got information there. Before I start with the talk, I'd like to just play the promotional, it's only 2 minutes, about Harif, and then I'll start the talk.
For almost 3,000 years, Jews lived in the Middle East and North Africa.
Leila Murad, she was the diva, the Barbara Streisand, if you will, of the Middle East.
The Jews who were born in the Middle East or North Africa, they always had these celebrations. It brings lots of luck.
أهلا بيكم رحتوا قاربي فرح بيكم زيتوا يا حبابي يا محلى اليوم أهلا وسهلا أهلا بيكم.
$850,000 refugees driven from their homes.
This is something that's being revived. It's something that's happened really for hundreds of years.
Harif, preserving the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, advocating for minority rights, fighting for justice for the forgotten refugees.
We don't only commemorate and focus on and recognize consciously the plight of our people, we celebrate the life of our people.
Harif, setting the record straight.
First of all, I'm on quite memorable territory because I know I went to school up the road here. I spent my teens going up and down Broadfields Avenue. Went to, when it used to be there, Orange Hill Girls' School. And when you used to come into this synagogue, you used to come the other way round. So I was slightly disorientated when I came here. Anyway, you might wonder why an Ashkenaz girl like me is giving this talk, a Sephardi talk, but I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I was born into a typical North London schmutter business family with grandparents who came from the East End. It was always my gift, fashion and textiles, and before I was even 20 years old, I'd started a fashion business on my own, and I was always backwards and forwards to France and to Paris, and eventually I stayed there by a turn of different events. This was like in the early 80s. And the fashion business at that time was 99% Jewish. It was a mixture of Eastern European Jews, mostly Polish, and the new Sephardi community. And I got to know everybody, both communities, and I'd always be hearing what both communities thought of each other, basically. So I've always stayed in contact with the people that I knew from that time, and I've been here for lots of the French community as they've come to England. I came back at the end of the 80s, the late 80s, but I've always kept a contact there. Now, before I talk about the French Jews in London, I want to explain to you about the post-World War II history of the Jews of France. Okay, so post-World War II, there were 340,000 Jews living in France in 1940. This is before the deportations, when more than 75,000 were deported to death camps, and about 72,500 were killed. After the Holocaust, around 180,000 Jews remained in France. Many of them were refugees from Eastern Europe who couldn't return home, or they didn't want to return to their former countries. It was mostly Poland. And due to the decline of the French Empire, there was a surge of Muslim anti-Semitism following the founding of the State of Israel from 48 onwards, the Israeli victories in the Six-Day Wars and other Arab-Israeli wars. So the Jews who were in North Africa left or fled in the 40s, 50s and 60s. So there were different waves. It was first of all the Algerians and then afterwards the Tunisians and the Moroccans. The wealthier of the Jews went to France, they went to Canada, the USA, and the poorer communities left for Israel. You were always aware when there was a wedding on that family would always be coming from around the world. It wasn't just family who were coming from, from Paris. It was always international. French nationals also left the French colonies, and they were called Pieds Noirs. And it originally referred to the Christians from Algeria, but it was a term afterwards that was used to describe the Jews as well. Pieds Noirs means Blackfoot, so there's lots of reasons why. Some people I know said it's because we were so poor and we didn't have shoes, but it's a term that was used for all of the non-Muslim North Africans. The Jews fell under this label. Now, by 1951, the Jewish population totaled around 250,000, and between 56 and 67, there were another 235,000 Jews from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco who emigrated to France. There were also Jews who came from Egypt after the expulsions in the 50s. So by 1968, Jews from the former French colonies in North Africa constituted the majority of the Jews of France, and they've since had a significant influence on the nature of the French Jewish culture. So by the 1980s, when I was there, the community was actually around 600,000. It was the largest in Europe. It's shrunk a little bit now. Today it's estimated at about 460,000. Right, here we go. So these were really big families. When the Jews arrived from North Africa, most people came from families where there were 8 or 9 children. They were not warmly received at all by the French Ashkenazi community. Most of them were survivors from the Holocaust, and they saw them as loud, brash, a little bit too Jewish. The Ashkenazim had learned to hide their Judaism. I mean, they never had any outward signs. There were no mezuzahs on the doors. They never wore jewelry. I mean, after all, that was the sign of deportation. If you had a mezuzah on your door, if you've survived the Holocaust. So there were big, big culture clashes. But the Sephardim were the total opposite. They were very influenced by the Lubavitch movement. They were deeply religious, proud Zionists. Everybody wore a big Star of David, big mezuzahs on the door. So, like in the fashion business, this was a really big clash. I remember when you used to go to people's homes, they all had a photo, and in the offices, of the Lubavitch Rabbi Schneerson. It was always proudly displayed in a really prominent position. So with these large families, they swelled this 180,000 post-war community to 600,000. And as much as the Jewish establishment didn't warm to them, their children did. So you had this integration with the next generation. From the Ashkenaz families, either your children married out or they married into a Sephardi family. That's how it was. So the younger generation, lots of them are from mixed families, but that was the dominant culture. So if you'd have come from an Ashkenaz culture, you were influenced by Sephardi culture. So there was big shifts going on. There's a very good film, actually. If you have a light evening, called XXL, which refers to like dress size XXL. It was about the fashion business and literally about this clash of different families and different cultures. So the Jews from North Africa followed their Sephardi traditions, and they integrated really well and did well business-wise, and they really invigorated the Jewish community. There were loads of kosher restaurants opening up, schools, and there was a whole religious renewal. At that time, there was the immigration, economic immigration of Muslims, first generation Muslims, and there were very, very good relations between the two communities. They all had memories of North Africa. In the fashion business, most of the workers were Muslim North African, and everybody got on really well. Things only changed in the 90s, which I'll come on to. But most people, they didn't leave for economic reasons, but out of fear. There was an actual fear. You'll always hear people saying how marvellous it was in Morocco, and they weren't chucked out of Morocco, but they were very fearful. They saw what happened in Algeria, they saw what happened in Tunisia, and for the older generations, they have memories of what happened before they were governed by the French. In 1912 in Fez, there was a big pogrom. There were over 50 Jews killed and lots of attacks. People remember those things, and that all stopped when the French took control. But when they left, they were very, very nervous, and so that's why they left. So, yeah, very few people, even when they did well in France, they never bought property. Everybody used to rent. I found it was a massive contrast coming from London, where everybody used to talk property and how much their property was worth and buying this and buying that. And nobody did. They all had suitcase syndrome, that they'd all might have to leave again at some point. And I actually think that that's one of the reasons why the French Jews have been able to leave so easily, because they've had this mentality of not buying property, always be prepared for changes in government and politics. Okay, this is the Sentier, this is the fashion district, which was really bustling, and if you ever go to Paris, it's changed now, it used to be 100% Jewish. It's in the second arrondissement. Down the spine is Rue Saint-Denis, which in those days, it was literally like a cross between Commercial Road and the Amsterdam red light district. It was a real shock. It was, you know, from someone who came from London. I remember when my mum came to visit me, and I'd got used to it, but, so, you know, this massive contrast. But it really was very different from the fashion business in London. You used to have first generation Tunisians, they'd be weaving in and out. That's just a typical scene. There'd always be trolleys going down the street. You'd always be avoiding all of these clothes rails and trolleys of cloth everywhere. That's a picture in the corner of my business. That was the frontage. And fortunes were made at that time in the 80s in the fashion business. There were big labels. Guess was a Moroccan company, Blanc Bleu. There were loads of big fashion labels that were made at the time. And there were also loads of kosher restaurants, because the North African community was strictly observant, so this flourished all at the same time. And when it came to the summer holidays, everything used to close down. The whole community used to go en masse to Juan-les-Pins in the south of France, next to Cannes, and it became like another Jewish city. You know, all of a sudden there were kosher restaurants opening, and it totally changed the whole spirit there. There was also a lot of black money going on at the time, and you literally used to have customs were not just at the airports and at the ports, they would literally be in the sentier. They'd be walking down, anybody with carrier bags of clothes, they'd be stopped in the streets, you'd have to produce all of the documentation, people could get arrested. In the late 90s, there was a big pyramid fraud. It was called the Sentier Affair, and it involved, sadly, all of these Tunisian Jews, and it was very bad publicity. And they're still the French Inland Revenue. They're literally over in Israel on the beaches trying to find the people who were involved. I've been told by people they literally go to the beaches listening for the French, trying to locate who was involved in this. Obviously, very, very bad publicity. Again, a great film to watch if ever you get a chance. La Vérité si je mens. It's a French film. It's all about the fashion business. It was so successful in France, across the whole population. They brought out 1, 2, 3, 4 versions, 4 episodes of it, that it was so popular. Comedy, so I think it's got subtitles, so it's definitely a great one to understand that period. Here we go. So now, first wave of Jews to London, because really there's been 2 waves. Now the first wave, they affectionately call themselves the Frenches. These were the ones who may have fallen in love with somebody either in France, on holiday in Israel, and they've assimilated well. They've often taken on the Ashkenaz traditions of their partners. Many of them came from much more religious homes. And later, a lot of the men started their own communities, their own synagogues, starting off in their homes with little minions, which they've expanded. I mean, this community has really grown. A lot of the United Synagogues have now got French services. You've got Sephardi synagogues attached. You've got in Stanmore, you've got Sephardi Synagogue, Kinloss, you've got the Persian one upstairs. In Hampstead Garden Suburb, in St John's Wood, you've got upstairs a whole French community, Anshe Shalom, and also Marble Arch Synagogue, so as well as all of these little independent synagogues. And at that time there was no Eurostar. Everybody travelled by plane, hovercraft, ferry. I remember those times at Calais waiting, bad weather, the hovercraft would get cancelled and you'd be on the ferry and what have you. Okay, now something happened. There was an organisation, a movement, which was called SOS Racism, Touche pas à mon peau, which was an anti-racism movement, and most of the participants were young North Africans who protested against racist crimes, and they had the full support of the Jewish community. It translates as "don't touch my mate, my buddy." But what happened was in the 90s something changed. And the second generation North African Muslims who lived in the banlieues, you hear people talking about the banlieues, that's the suburbs on the other side of the périphérique. So you've got like the ring road that goes around Paris. If ever you come into Paris on the bus or what have you on the coach, you see all of these high-rise blocks around, especially northeast Paris. And they suddenly the Muslims started identifying themselves with the Palestinians. That was their cause. I think a big contribution to this was the new cable TV stations, particularly Al Jazeera, had a massive influence. Before everybody was friends, but in the 90s it all changed. There were places which still is a hotspot, like Sarcelles, which is northeast Paris, very much like Gants Hill. I describe Sarcelles like Gants Hill. Sorry, can everybody hear? I didn't realise I was in the wrong position there for the microphone. Let me know if you can't hear me. And basically Sarcelles was a mixed suburb, and now this is somewhere where people are moving out of, even if they can't afford to, because it was a poor community in Sarcelles. And they're moving to the western suburbs, and really, you know, they can't afford to, or they're making aliyah to Israel with the poorer communities. And then the holiday destination changed. So instead of everybody going en masse to Juan-les-Pins in the summer, it was Netanya. Everybody realized that the future was Israel and not the south of France. That's where they decided to invest their money. You know, when I said people didn't buy homes, they started buying homes in Israel as they started becoming successful. And you had what was called the Boeing Aliyah, where you had people who stayed in Paris, the breadwinners earning the money, and they would send their families to live and grow up in Israel, and they'd commute on the weekends, literally backwards and forwards to between Israel and Paris. Now, a very big turning point was in 2006 when Ilan Halimi, he was a French-Moroccan young lad, and he was tortured and murdered for being a Jew by a gang of Muslims. It was the most brutal story ever. How many of you have heard of it? Okay, oh good, but not everybody, okay. I remember at the time I was always following French news, and I was literally writing to the Jewish Chronicle to report on it, and they literally put something very small 2 weeks after it happened, when it was massive. 100,000 people went to the streets to protest. There were massive demonstrations. It was the most cruel thing. It happened over a few weeks when he was kidnapped, and the neighbours heard his screams. He was burnt and set on fire and fingers cut off. Most awful. It was like a mini concentration camp that they made, and nobody called the police. That's, if the story wasn't bad enough, nobody called the police. So it was a massive turning point, and it goes on. Even 2 weeks ago, was it 2 weeks ago? A couple of weeks ago, 2 trees, sorry, that's why I'm mixing up the numbers, 2 trees which were in his memory in different parts of Paris were desecrated. One was chopped down and the other one was cut up. I mean, it just goes on. It just goes on. It doesn't stop. It's a really, I can't even, I've got all of the details here of what happened. I can't even read them out because it's such a ghastly story. But if you want to know more, I'd Google it. But it is a really terrible, tragic story. And that was a massive turning point. Okay, so this is the sad major incidents, okay? So in March 2012, you may remember the Toulouse school murders by Mohammed Merah. He killed the teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Sandler, and his 2 eldest children, and the 8-year-old Miriam Monsonego, the daughter of the head teacher. Then in July 2014, you may remember it was being filmed live at the time, there were violent anti-Israel demonstrations in Barbès, which is in the north part of Paris. It followed by a siege of Jews in the Rue de Roquette synagogue, and literally the Jews were barricaded in. It was literally a pogrom. They were literally baying for them outside the synagogue. In January 2015, there was the Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket where 4 Jews died, plus other incidents around the Jewish places that weren't in the media. In fact, I remember reading the French press at the time, and there were so many incidents. There was one in Sarcelles that was going on at the same time. And actually, they had tried previously, before they went to the supermarket, they'd been to a Jewish school, but they couldn't get in because of security outside. They realized that there was no point trying to get in. In February 2015, in Nice, there was a stabbing attack of a Jew. In November 2015, in Marseille, 3 Jewish men were stabbed outside a synagogue. On Friday, the 13th of November in 2015, there were the coordinated attacks across Paris. There were 130 people randomly killed There was the football stadium, the various cafes, and of course the Bataclan Club. The Bataclan was probably targeted because the owner was very pro-Israel. There had been demonstrations previously outside. He'd actually sold it, but it was associated with somebody who supported Israel. It was in 2009. There were anti-Israel attacks outside the Bataclan. January 2016, a 35-year-old teacher in Marseille was attacked with a matchet by a Kurdish teenager, and a Jewish councillor in the Paris suburb of Créteil was murdered in his own apartment. August the 18th, 2016, in Strasbourg, a Jewish man was stabbed. In 25th of January 2017, not a murder, but a turning point that Georges Bensoussan, who's a historian well known for his history of the Shoah, of the Jews of North Africa, he had a trial for inciting hatred because he had discussed during a he quoted an Algerian sociologist that his words were that France could not hope to integrate its Maghrebi immigrants unless it recognized that these immigrants imbibe anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. So he was up on racism charges over that. He's since been acquitted, but he's been sacked from his job at the Shoah Institute, and he's now making Aliyah. In April 2017, Dr. Sarah Halimi, Parisian doctor, she was thrown from her window by her Muslim neighbor who'd been abusing her and her daughter for years. It wasn't reported in the French press, and there was a demonstration outside her home a couple of days later by hundreds of people from the Jewish community, and they were just shouted on by their Muslim neighbors and had bottles chucked down on them. March 2018, Myriel Noll, she was an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor, murdered by two assailants, one a neighbor she'd known since childhood, and one allegedly shouted Allah Akbar as they stabbed her. And then recently, in February 2019, with the Gilets Jaunes protests, which I'll talk about afterwards, Alan Finkielkraut, he's a 69-year-old Jewish philosopher and academic, very well known, always on French TV, and he was confronted with anti-Semitic abuse during the protests. Dirty Zionists, they yelled, go back to Tel Aviv. The police had to step in to protect him. Right. The Eurostar, which was completed in 1993, and that totally changed. Sorry, sounds, okay? You've got to remind me. And this changed communications between London and Paris. Now, this group, we're going to call them the Feuge, which is French slang for Jews. It's back to front, juif, Feuge. The slang is, in France, it's back to front, and they affectionately use this name for themselves. Now, the second generation of French Sephardi Jews were educated in the main professions. And from the end of the 90s, there was a slow trickle. They took city jobs, loads of them worked for the city bankers. It's a very common misunderstanding that they fled France because of anti-Semitism. They didn't, they came here for economic reasons. Very hard in France if you're an entrepreneur. All the rules are against you. And it was nice. It was very easy to come here. You know, it was very quick. They'd return. They'd go back for Shabbat on Friday afternoon. They could be back in their offices on Monday morning. Many of the youngsters who came took on this one. I think I said this in the beginning. They took on the dominant Sephardi culture and became much more religious than their parents. Many in this community have stayed, married, started families. So life in London and the 21st arrondissement. So the numbers have grown, believed to be over 5,000 now. Although we think of South Kensington as Little France, for the Sephardi community, it started around Belsize Park and expanded to St John's Wood, West Hampstead. They associated themselves with this Anshe Shalom synagogue, which was originally in Maida Vale. It was an Iraqi synagogue, and they took premises upstairs to St John's Wood United Synagogue. So that's like the centre. So they mostly stayed around this area. They didn't want to go to the suburbs. You know, just hearing the word banlieues is like, no, we're not moving outside. They just saw coming to Golders Green as food shopping. I remember when I interviewed lots of people, they called it the Quartier Noir because of all the black hats. But it's changed. They've suddenly realised that it's okay to be in the suburbs of London, and not like the suburbs of Paris. But it's been a long journey. And also, if you wonder why, when you go to Golders Green, why there's so many kosher restaurants always cropping up, it's because of the French community. You know, they want to eat out all the time, they're kosher, and so they fueled this, what's the word? I'm trying to think. But anyway, this whole new kashrut that's happened. So, and interestingly at the time, I remember saying, you know, when they said they only came to Golders Green for food, what about Temple Fortune? They had no idea that there was anything other than this one place, Golders Green, to go to. They'd never explored outside, but again, it has changed. And also, there's, in Camden now, there's 3 Erevim, which was fueled by the French community. There's one for St John's Wood, there's one Belsize Park, Camden Town, and also Brunsbury Park. There's a Jewish school in Brunsbury Park, and it's now 60% Jewish, French Jewish children there. So it's all changed. The young community is very insular. They socialise amongst themselves rather than the wider Jewish community. I know most of the big organisations have tried to lure them, Zionist Federation and all of these. They haven't been that successful. It's mostly been Chabad. There's an association, Tau, which has pulled them into their events, but for the wider community, not a lot. They love it that they can be openly Jewish in London, which you can't in Paris. You know, there's lots of rules there. They're very in step with Israel. They've all got family there. Most of them lean to the right, very Zionistic. You remember after the murders with the kosher Delhi and after the Charlie Hebdo that Netanyahu was quick to go over to Paris where he was really feted. I don't know if you remember all the videos at the time. So very, very well received by the French community. Because okay, so in June 2016, they had their annual fundraising event. They brought the chief rabbi over from France, and they brought a French singer, Gilbert Montagnier, and there were literally hundreds of people there, and they raised an enormous sum of money. It was 180,000 euros was raised for the evening for French organisations, their equivalent of Jewish Care and whatever. So still very attached to France and their families who still remain there. Brexit. Didn't want to do too much on Brexit, and unavoidable because it keeps changing day by day. Now, this charity event that we went to, I can see my colleague Lynn Julius, who founded Harif, who's in the audience, and we were there together. And there was a big black cloud over the community because it was just a couple of days after the Brexit results. The event was at the Roxy. It was near Canary Wharf. It was like at the ends of Commercial Road. And when the French chief rabbi gave his speech, he said how they felt that Boris was their friend, inviting them over from France, being very warm to them previously, and there was this feeling that they'd been stabbed in the back. And there was enormous applause from that. I've interviewed lots of people over the last 2.5 years, and I've heard lots of sentiments over Brexit, and everybody I've spoken to is very, very wounded over the UK decision, and they no longer feel that the UK is their home as they'd previously done. There's a feeling of being stateless. Everybody is really stunned. I'm just quoting: unwelcome, betrayed, shocked, paid taxes here. Some have already left. A few people I know have left for Israel. Other people following their jobs. A lot of them, they're working in the city. This is the second generation I'm talking about. This is the younger generation, not the people who married here and have brought up children here. I'm talking about the young singles. Others are talking about it, going to Canada, America, but no one wants to go back to France. No one wants to go back to France. Question, are the French here to stay? We can discuss that afterwards. For many people, they've got to follow their employers. I think there will be commuting. I think because people are at these schools, like we're talking about the North London Jewish Day School in Brunsbury Park, and if you've been transferred to Dublin, it's very easy to commute, especially as you've seen in your community that older generations, this Boeing generation who were commuting backwards and forwards from Paris to Tel Aviv, I think there will be quite a bit of that happening as well, especially as some of the banks are moving. In fact, when Lynn and I were at that event, Credit Suisse had just announced that the second that Article 50 is instigated, they'd be moving to Europe and to make their plans for schools and everything else if they wanted to stay with the bank. So nobody actually knows. I haven't got any answers because we didn't. I was presuming that we would be knowing a little bit more. So that's still very open. Are the French here to stay? Gilets jaunes. Is this yellow vest movement anti-Semitic? Well, it started out, I don't know who's been following it, it started life as a protest against fuel taxes, but there's no leader. It's broadened out, it's had different interest groups, it's attracted people from the extreme right, the extreme left. When I was looking for photographs, they're there with their kafirs. It didn't start out that way. It was a lot of people from the countryside, but it's taken a totally different direction now. We saw in the previous slide about Alan Finkielkraut and police having to step in to protect him. And also, one of the increases, there have been, lots of, when I've looked at different posters, you can see here, for the bankers to get out, and it's all, there's lots of feeling of anti-Semitic tropes and Rothschilds controlling the finances in France, and so it's really difficult to know whether it's just going to fizzle out or how it's going to form into the future. Now, over here on the picture on the right, we can see a picture of people wearing their vests. Now, alongside the comedian Dieudonné Mabala, who was a Holocaust denier and a propagator of anti-Semitic hatred. And they're doing here the reverse Heil Hitler. It's called the Grenelle. And there they are with their yellow vests. So it's not a good sign. It's not a good sign.
Thank you. You've mentioned various reasons why the French have leaving France, you haven't mentioned, I'd have thought, the one major one, which is the rise of Jean-Marie Le Pen and his daughter as well, with the Front National. Is that still a threat in
No,
France?
that's actually changed. It's quite interesting. At the last elections, there was changes, and I was quite surprised that there was a little bit of support. Don't forget, his daughter kicked her father out. Jean-Marie Le Pen was kicked out, trying to soften up their image a little bit. Some people have fallen for it. It's a difficult one. It's a very, very difficult one, that. Everybody remembers her father, but no one's actually seeing that from the Jewish community as the threat. That's not what they're seeing as their threat. They're seeing their threat come mostly from the Muslim community. It was originally, that was the threat. In the 80s, that was definitely Jean-Marie Le Pen, that was. And I remember when he won a big percentage of the vote, but was it in the 90s when he won a big percentage? I can't remember, but I remember being absolutely shocked by it. But I've noticed people's views have shifted. They're not seeing them as the big threat that they were previously. Yes.
Right, I have a quick question. There was an influx of Jews from France after the accession of President Hollande, who won the election in 2012 and put up taxes. So to what extent did that...
Exactly, that did make a difference, definitely. When I said it was for economic reasons coming here, it wasn't because of anti-Semitism coming to London. Not going back to Paris is the fear of anti-Semitism there. And in everybody's homes, there is a big discussion, what are we going to do? And also the fear of Corbyn as well. So, there's a big discussion going on.
Are there a large number of Jews making Aliyah?
Where, from France or from London?
From France.
Yes, absolutely. They don't keep figures. They don't keep the figures of Jews leaving. You've got figures from Israel about the Jews who are making Aliyah. You haven't got figures about Jews going to America, going to Canada. There's no figures for that.
May I change the subject?
Oh, hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. For the rest of the people, I come from Algeria. I am French, but I have dual nationality, so I'm okay. Yeah.
You're just the Frenchy generation.
That's right. I just wanted to know, you mentioned religious Jews. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of young people who are not religious, who are totally absorbed in the secular. And my family, all my cousins who are about my age and younger, they are all assimilated. They don't feel that they are threatened at all. So I wanted to put that.
That's a good point to put over, because because they're under the radar. They're not there. They're not attending the synagogues and the Jewish events. So they are, in fact, and when I was discussing this before with Lynn about numbers and figures, it's easy to get them from the synagogues. But if people aren't affiliated to a synagogue, it's very difficult to know. Like in South Kensington, in places where you've got a large French community, you're not actually sure of the numbers there of who's Jewish and who isn't. It's Jocelyn, isn't it?
Yes, it's
That's right. I remember interviewing you about your daughter's henna. No more questions? Well, then it's time to say thank you.
I'd now like to call on Nicole Duke to propose the vote of thanks.
That's for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
But let me say thank you officially.
Oh, thank you
okay?
very much.
Thank you very much for your explanation about French people. I can tell you one or two things about French people, but I leave it to you. The floor was
I
yours.
finished. Was there anything I missed out?
Oh, plenty. But I just want to tell you that they're not just Sephardi Jews. There are a lot of Ashkenazi Jews. Mm-hmm. I'm one of them. And I came to this country in 1967.
Right.
So I've been here for a long time, but we leave it to what you said. It was very, very interesting, very nice. And I promise you, the French people are here to stay.
Good.
I have no doubt.
Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.